I don't know how qualified I am to talk about the future. Over the years, we've tried at Dartington just to stay at the edge of what's going on. We've talked in the past about the integration of children's services. Prevention and early intervention was mentioned earlier on. This focus on outcomes, a lot of that's come from Dartington. The focus on evidence-based programs. And the word we've not used today, place-based reform. I mean, people talk about collective impact these days. That's the new word for place-based reform. But really, all of the work you're talking about today has been about place-based reform. When I'm going to produce a series of publications this year about where I think the future of children's services is going. When I do that, I'm really driven by my understanding of the science of child development. If I was an economist, I'd be telling a different story. I'd probably all have you in tears if I were an economist. If I were a political scientist, I would be talking about different things, which is, you know, for example, why is it when child abuse distributes across society and across the classes, we only focus child protection services on poor children? They would be the kind of questions I'd be asking. And I suppose one thing I just want to say about the outset is the backdrop, which is about the economic backdrop. And I don't know enough about Scotland to know how you're getting on with that here. In England, one example, a director of children's services asked Louise and I to come and talk to him recently. He said, 15 years ago, you came and did some work here, and we invested 25 million a year in early intervention from that moment. And on top of that, we invested in children's centres, which we obviously have in England. He said, today our budget is the core budget, excluding schools, is 132 million per year. And in 2020, it will be 68 million pounds per year. And option one is to get rid of all of that early intervention and all of the children's centres. What do we do about it? So in England, it is a dire situation, and we're getting a lot of demand to think about how we move out of that dire situation. And I suspect some of that is coming your way here in Scotland. I've only got a short time, so I'm just going to do a few highlights and try and stick to time. 5 themes from the science to begin with. One, I think we're going to see a shift of a focus on an interest in babies, conception to 2, to an interest in what we call transition to adulthood, 16 to 24. That doesn't mean we don't think about babies anymore. We have to be pluralist in all of these things, but it's going to be babies and it's going to be other populations as well. And the reason for that is that the drive around babies came from the evidence on rapid child development in conception to 2, but we now understand really well that there's also rapid development in the brain around puberty. There's also rapid development in the brain in later adolescence. And also because we know that when you take key concepts in conception to 2, like attachment, which do have very powerful predictive force, but we do know that a lot of kids that are exposed to very poor early environments later on do well. And a lot of that is around the science, for example, of resilience, some of which you know quite a lot about. So, for example, our colleague at the University of Cardiff, Stephen Collishaw, looked at children who had been exposed to mothers with poor mental health. And he finds out a high proportion of those children actually do really well. And when he looks at the factors that contribute to their resilience, he generally finds it's their ability to form strong relationships with a teacher, with another relative, with somebody in the neighbourhood, with a friend, that provides them the resilience to get through really difficult times. And recently there's a lot of focus on what we call orchid children. So orchid children are children with a genetic predisposition to either do really well or do really badly. They can flourish and be beautiful, or they can fail very easily. Put an orchid child in a family where there are very difficult family circumstances and they will fail. Put them in a situation where there are very good family circumstances and they will flourish. So trying to get these differences into our thinking about public services, I think, is going to be really important. Two more things on 16 to 24. Naomi Eisenstadt, who's a trustee at Dartington, is also the First Minister's advisor on poverty and has produced a report recently. And she herself focuses on 16 to 24 as a very important area for development in the poverty context. And from a political context, I'm a parent of 2 children who are 16 to 24, and it's just amazing to me that they're not more pissed off than they are because they're getting a really raw deal. So we might want to do something about that. Second theme, a shift from outcomes to connection. That doesn't mean pluralism again. We don't give up on outcomes and go to connection, but I think we're going to get much more interested in connection as we move forward. One of our colleagues over here talked about getting to the complex populations, and my colleagues at Dartington, Tim and Luke and Daniel, have been working on that, and recently they surveyed all the 16 to 24-year-olds in the London borough of Camden, and that includes the kids on the street, the homeless kids, everybody. And what they found was a quarter of young people, 16 to 24, had poor outcomes in the way that Louise described it earlier on. 84% of children that they surveyed were supported by civil society. They were supported by neighbours, community, friends. And within that 84%, there was a proportion, about 50%, that were also supported by public sector services. Interestingly, public sector services didn't support anybody that didn't already get support from civil society. And what that meant at the end, that in Camden, there were a quarter, 24% of children with poor outcomes were not getting support from either civil society or public systems. If we don't connect to children, if we exclude children in schools, if we exclude children in the labour force, if we exclude children in terms of access to public sector services, they are not going to get better outcomes. So connection is obviously going to be an important part of the work that we do as we move forward. Thirdly, a shift in a focus on individual trajectories to a focus to the context in which children operate. So again, pluralism, that doesn't mean we give up on individual trajectories, but we're also going to, I think, focus on the context. I went to a very nice presentation in Munich a few weeks ago by Van Eisendorn, who's one of the great leaders of attachment research from the University of Leiden. And he put a group of 30 6-year-olds in a classroom, and he gave them a task that they had to do individually, and he filmed them doing a task. It was a difficult task, and he wanted to find out whether they cheated. What proportion do you think cheated? How many would say below 50%? Put your hands up if you think it's below 50%. 6-year-olds. Above 50%. Yeah, the pessimists have it right. 70% cheated. And then Van Eisendorn then cheated himself. He said, we know when you're cheating. And the number of cheaters goes down to 30%. There's a very interesting story about that 30%, by the way, and how well they do in society moving forward. Learning to cheat is a very effective strategy. But what that tells you is the context really makes a difference. Last week I was at another meeting with a great leader in child development research called Felton Earls, and he did a study like the Edinburgh study of the trajectories of children that were high risk to commit crimes as they grew older. And what he found in Chicago was those children living in communities where there was strong collective efficacy committed fewer crimes than those children if they lived in communities where there was low collective efficacy. Collective efficacy is a mixture of trust and a willingness to intervene. I often think about it as, would I leave my keys when I go away with my next door neighbour and let them look after my house? Where you get that in a community, you get lower levels of problems. Felton Earls, very interestingly, has used this to train young people to build collective efficacy in communities with effects like reduced violence, reduced crime, and reduced transmission of HIV/AIDS in different countries. My colleague Nick Axford is doing a study of Kiva, a program from Finland that essentially is trying to get children to interact with each other, building trust, helping them to intervene with each other, and that's reducing bullying in schools. So the context, I think, is going to be important as the individuals moving forward. Fourthly, a shift from intervention to relationships. That doesn't mean that intervention is unimportant, but relationships are going to be important too. We've recently, if you go to our website, you can download for free a book on this called Bringing Everything I Am into One Place, where colleagues from Scotland helped us to put together a study on the focus on relationships with children who were facing severe and multiple disadvantages, and several colleagues, including Angela Morgan, who spoke earlier on, were involved in that work. A couple of practical examples of what that means. This week I was talking to a colleague from an organisation called Pause. She works with mothers who have children, have them taken into care, have those children taken away, so they have another child. And that child's taken away, so then they have another child. All local authorities have this particular problem. What does she do with those mothers? She has workers who are trained to form trusting relationships with the mothers, and the mothers are trusted, she doesn't actually find out, to go on long-term contraception. She says, we will work with you long-term if you'll go on long-term contraception. She doesn't find out whether that happens or not. And the effect of that has been to radically reduce the number of children these mothers are having, and therefore the number of children taken into the care system. Ian Gordon is here from the Bethany Trust. He's running a programme that we are trialling in the UK called Safe Families for Children, where we're taking children who otherwise would have gone into the care system, and we provide 3 types of volunteer. One, somebody will provide resources, all from the community. Somebody will provide resources, somebody will provide friendship, not therapy, friendship, and somebody will provide respite, a place for the children to sleep overnight for short periods of time. And we're predicating that this intervention will reduce the flow of children coming into care by 10%. It's not intervention, it's relationships that are getting to that place. Fifthly, I think we're going to move, Louise hinted at this earlier on, from an era where we're thinking all the time about addition, more evidence-based programs, more this, more that, and more to an area where we're thinking about subtraction. I could give so many studies. I'm very, very taken by the Edinburgh longitudinal study that shows if you take somebody who's high risk of committing crime and then you arrest them, the arrest means that they commit more crimes in the future than if you didn't arrest them. There's a potential for less intervention to get to better outcomes. We also, I'm mindful of the fact that we at Dartington are pushing the evidence base, but the evidence base is changing. A lot of you are talking about family nurse partnership, but the evidence on family nurse partnership is changing. There have been 3 trials in the United States showing really good results, and now there's 1 trial from England, maybe that's not relevant in Scotland, that shows 0 results in terms of effectiveness. We have to take the evidence whichever way it goes, and that's going to think about what kinds of things that we commission and what things that we don't. I want to go back briefly to this local authority earlier on that I mentioned, where they had 132 million and now they're going to have 68 million. And do they cut all the early help stuff? What do they do? Why does that happen? It took us a while to figure this out. All of the children in the early help system, early intervention system, are different from the children in the high-end system. They don't connect in any kind of way. You don't go through one system to get to the other system. You sit over here or you sit over here. And all the workers in the early help and early intervention area don't interact with those in the high-end system. So you've got 2 separate systems. So one of the solutions they may find is to connect them. Or the other is, which is the radical option we're going to go for, is that we're going to reduce the high-end systems as a way of protecting the budget of the early help. So instead of getting rid of the early help, we're going to reduce the number of children in care by 50%. We've had good experience of doing this in Dartington. We worked in New York, where we reduced the number of children in care from 50,000 to 32,000. It subsequently went down to 18,000. We don't know whether that's going to be good for kids. We're going to find out. And I'm mindful of this in Scotland, where you have 126% of more children in care than we do in England. You have a different system. Of course, a lot of those children are supported in the community, are supported at home with families, but even when you take them out, you still have 5% more children in care in Scotland than we do in England. And you have 2.5 more times children in residential care. Maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. I don't have evidence to say that's good or it's bad. But in the economic context in which we're facing, I think we have to set up experiments where we begin to reduce some shibboleths of children's services and see what effect that has on outcomes. And we're going to try and do that in a couple of local authorities in England. It would be nice to try and replicate that in Scotland. Okay, just a few words about the consequences, then I'll close. What do I take from those 5 points? First of all, civil society is the primary source of support for children and young people. It is not an add-on to public sector services. It is the primary source of support, and public sector services can support what goes on inside the community. And civil society means not just voluntary organisations, but the families, neighbours, communities, all those other informal links, churches. These are things that are really making a difference to children's lives, and we've left it out of a lot of the equations that we've been thinking about in the last few years. I think the Deputy First Minister talked quite eloquently about that. Secondly, it's okay to try and help children in trouble with effective interventions, but as much, at least, if not more, can be achieved by creating a context for children to grow up as best they can. Building collective efficacy is one example I've given in communities and in schools, and making young people the leaders of building that efficacy instead of seeing young people as the potential recipients of intervention. Thirdly, GERFEC is about outcomes, but GERFEC is also about connection. If we've got a quarter of our children, you saw some of that in the circles earlier on, and the limitations of that data that were mentioned, when we take that data further forward, we still find a quarter of children with high-end needs, with no contact with public sector services and no contact with civil society. That's a disaster for young people, and it's a disaster for society. One of my most successful publications was about 20 odd, maybe more years, 25 years ago now, called Matching Needs and Services. And I keep thinking about this when I look at these data and think maybe there's an opportunity to open that up again. Fourthly, we have to innovate in the context of austerity. Louise talked a little bit about this, but one of the things I would stress is we really have to look at some of the services that haven't really changed much over a 100-year period. Children in care, residential care, lots of others you will know about, special educational needs. These are shibboleths that we might want to reflect on. And fifthly, I want to echo something Bernadette said right at the outset, that this is about people and it's about relationships. There's a lot of focus in England at the moment on devolution. We're about sort of 15 years behind the curve on that one with you. But so people are trying to devolve responsibility from the Treasury to cities like Greater Manchester. But the work that I've been doing is around what I call double devolution. Because if the responsibility is devolved just to local authorities, it's not going to make a difference. The local authorities also have to devolve accountability and responsibility down to local communities and local neighbourhoods. We did a very nice piece of work a few years ago for the big lottery called A Better Start. We were trying to improve outcomes for children conception to 3 years of age, a £240 million investment in 5 local authorities. And we were working with scientists that wanted to improve speech and language, nutrition, emotional well-being of children. And we were working with public systems that wanted to reduce the pressure on high-end services. And we were working with mums in high-risk communities. And what did they want? They also want better speech and language for their kids. They probably want also public systems to have less pressure on high-end services. They don't want their kids to go anywhere near those high-end services. But they also wanted, first of all, jobs, because they wanted income. They wanted transport because they felt isolated and cut off in their communities, and they wanted better housing because they were living in conditions that were unacceptable for bringing up children. If we're going to make progress, we have to work with the community and the public system and with the scientific community. A couple of challenges for the catalysts. Kenneth is coming on to talk at the moment. Robertson have done more than most in this area, but I think this is a moment for philanthropy, and I think philanthropy in the UK on the whole is failing in its responsibilities to think about what we do in the context of this severe austerity. The way in which philanthropy thinks about public systems is prehistoric. Public systems are often seen as the problem, not the solution, but public systems, as Louise mentioned earlier on, spend £5,000 per year per annum. The leverage of that money, changing how that money is spent, is the thing that philanthropy can make a difference with. And that means engaging with public systems. Philanthropy seems to think that the voluntary sector is the solution. The voluntary sector is absolutely a part of the solution, but so is the public sector. And that's something that's going to need to change. And the other aspect is a kind of prehistoric approach by philanthropy to evaluation. I haven't come across one example from the UK, from philanthropic funding, that has made an international difference to the way in which we approach children's services. All of the stuff that's coming is coming from the United States, and that's something that's going to need to change if we're going to make a difference. My colleague Kate, who's based in the Dartington Glasgow office, is doing a lot of work on this question of evaluation, and I'm doing a lot of work on the question of how we evaluate differently in the context of innovation. The research community, we too have responsibility. The quality of the evaluation is really important, but speed of evaluation is important. Family Nurse Partnership began 35 years ago. It had 3 trials in the 1980s, and the last trial came out last year. And the net result after 35 years is, we're not really sure if it works or not. That's too long to wait. We have to be able to speed up our processes and provide evidence as things are innovating. The Deputy First Minister this morning talked about Harry Burns and his work on data. Metadata, I beg your pardon, is going to change the way we think about the design of services. Yesterday I came up by train, I booked my ticket by Trainline. When I look at The Guardian online this morning, it's peppered with adverts to Trainline, which is the company I booked the ticket with. That's affecting every single thing that we do, and metadata is going to affect the way in which we think about services moving forward. And we in the academic community have got to think differently about how we collect data. And a lot of opportunities are going to come from technology. Even in the last year, Dartington has produced apps that allow young people to rate their services, to find and rate their services. We've produced apps that help people to match needs and services. We produce an app that helps people to get a service on the day they need it, not 6 weeks later, which is when they generally get it from Children's Services. And we have apps that allow practitioners to collect real-time the kinds of data on outcomes that Louise has been presenting for the local authority, to collect that for children on a case-by-case basis. Okay, I'll end there. I think it's a very, as I say, I'm not absolutely sure of the context here in Scotland. But I think it's going to be a very, very difficult 5 to 10 years coming up. The stated objective of the UK government is to reduce expenditure of GDP per capita on public services from 42% to 35%. That was revised up a few days ago to 36.5%. But it is a huge drop. And that, I think, whether you agree with that or disagree with that, that's what's going to happen. And that's going to mean a different relationship, I think, between public sector services and civil society. It's going to make a big difference to the political and economic context in which services are designed. I think the science of child development can continue to play a very important role in helping to shape that future, but that engagement between science, policy, and civil society, I think exemplified in some of the work that Louise and her colleagues have been doing here in Scotland, is going to be a core part of that journey. Thank you very much.